Hello, my name is Dr. Michelle Cohen-Gibbs. I'm an assistant professor and head of the Bachelor of Arts program in theater at Illinois Wesleyan University in Bloomington, Illinois. The title of my lecture for you today is Memorializing the Folk, Uncovering Southern Black Folk Oral Traditions in Zora Neale Hurston's iconic book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. Now, before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. This land was not always cared for by us. It was cared for by others who came before us. Today, I rest on the lands that were once cared for by the native nations, including the Kickapoo, Peoria, Sioux, and Miami. I want you to take a moment to reflect on the named and unnamed persons who are the caretakers for the ground on which you stand. Let's give thanks and always remind ourselves that we too are charged with being good stewards to the lands that have meant so much to so many people. My professor in graduate school used to tell us to think of our ideas that float around in our minds like grapes. Yep, grapes, the fruit. Grapes are refreshing and full of goodness, sort of like ideas. And when they explode, boom, those ideas can go everywhere. For the purposes of our time together, I want you to imagine your ideas that form in your mind grapes as just that, mind grapes. Also, you'll notice that in our time together, I'm going to use two terms. One is folks, and the other is folk. Folks, with an X at the end, describes all people from all walks of life who are part of the human experience. This is inclusive of identities that often get left out of the conversation, like queer bodies. Folk refers to Southern Black folk subcultures. That will be the focus of our time together. So take a moment and imagine in your mind grapes a popular physical place where folks gather. Think of a place for conversation, to share experiences about school, after-school activities like practices and rehearsals, weekend adventures, work, and the like. Where's this physical gathering place? Now hold that place in your mind grapes. Now imagine some popular physical places where folks gather to learn. This could be anywhere you can learn something new or hear a new perspective or refreshing perspective about something. Now finally, in your mind grapes, imagine one place where you gather to tell stories, to participate in family and friend rituals, a place where you're engaging in oral traditions that can go way back in your family tree. Take those three places and see if you can select one. One place that does all those things. A place to gather, a place to learn, and a place to tell stories. You got anything else in your mind grapes? If you said the dinner table, well, that's a really good option for sure. Or the kitchen table. Better so, think of Thanksgiving dinner. Food is a unifier and it does an amazing job of bringing people together to learn and tell stories. These places are shared spaces. Shared spaces are areas where people experience community in ways that can promote healing through conversation. Shared spaces are important for cultivating, continuing, and maintaining lots of oral traditions. An oral tradition is a form of communication where cultural knowledge and information are shared from person to person in an effort to keep community traditions and practices present and part of everyone's everyday lived experience. The oral tradition promotes the preservation of important rituals and customs that help people know themselves as part of a community. Identity and difference are wrapped up in oral traditions, such that orality can actually reinforce who people in a community believe themselves to be, as part of this greater whole. Difference points to how community attempts to reinforce what they see as a set of normal ways that people inhabit their roles. It's like this. Imagine if you're the oldest person among your siblings, and you've been told your whole life that you're responsible for the younger kids. There are special stories that are shared about other family members who have held the responsibility of being the oldest. Well, you would probably believe that you are responsible for your little siblings. In fact, you would say, I am the oldest, therefore I must be responsible for my siblings. Going forward, there's an expectation from your parents, from the people in your community, that you perform the role of older sibling. And if you don't perform this role at the expected standards, well, you're different. For good or for worse, you are not like the community. And in some communities, this could be enough to get you expelled or exiled. In short, the stories and the traditions that we tell ourselves, that are told to us or shared with us, can be more profound than just hearing a good story or sharing in a life lesson or being told to look after your little siblings. These stories and traditions are part of the oral tradition and can help shape the people we are, the people we become, and the people that folks expect us to be. Hold that in your mind, grapes. We'll come to that point later. Anthropologist, ethnographer, novelist, and playwright Zora Neale Hurston understood the importance of oral traditions. She explored real-life shared spaces among Black people in the early 20th century. She was particularly interested in how Black people in Southern Black folk subcultures told stories as a way of community gathering. She was interested in how these subcultures used storytelling as a theatrical and performative experience for Southern Black folk communities to remember their stories, so that their stories and practices would never be forgotten. As an anthropologist, she felt it was her responsibility to listen and watch and record these stories. She was not supposed to be part of the community, but she was expected to keep her distance from the action in order to be an observant listener. But as a Black woman from the same communities that she recorded, she knew that she couldn't merely listen and watch like what was expected of most anthropologists. She knew she needed to be an ethnographer. She had insider knowledge and her own perspective about the stories and the histories being told. So she inserted her opinion and perspective about the stories from a place of someone who was already familiar with the stories being told. As a novelist and playwright, she memorialized the stories of the folk by retelling them in unique, compelling, and theatrical ways. Often the stories of the folk would appear again and again in many of her writings and plays. Characters would appear in one retelling only to resurface in another. This was especially important to Hurston, given the racist ways that Black people were being portrayed in the media during the time period. Blackface minstrel shows where white people would dress up and portray caricatures of Blackness that made them seem almost less than human. These were very popular. Hurston pushed back against these racist depictions by retelling stories and the histories about real Black people that she met on her travels. Her hope was that audiences would see the humanity and fullness of Black lives. By including the stories of the folk, Zora Neale Hurston was creating an archive or a record of real Black people who lived beloved, vibrant, and meaningful lives in the early 20th century that we still remember today. Hurston's creative works demonstrate how oral traditions play an important role in preserving Southern Black folk subculture of the early 20th century. Hurston's creative works also demonstrate that by maintaining an archive of these practices, it is an act of necessity to combat racist caricatures of Blackness. In this lecture, we will look at how Hurston's most iconic and memorable work of fiction, her novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, she memorializes Southern Black folk subculture, specifically by concentrating on one place, the porch. We will focus our mind grapes on how the porch is a social space that can reinforce and ritualize the identity of a Southern Black folk subculture. First, we'll define what is the porch. Then we'll look at how this rather ordinary site is a space for reinforcing identity and difference. Next, we will review how Hurston uses the porch to memorialize Southern Black folk subcultures. Where does the porch appear in her other collection of ethnographic folk stories, like Mules and Men? Finally, we will analyze why the porch, and why does this matter? Why does memorializing the folk provide a positive legacy for Black folks today? Their Eyes Were Watching God follows the character of Janie from childhood through middle adulthood. Janie is a Black woman in the early 20th century. Her options for education and marriage are limited, but Janie is determined to live her life open and free. After her first loveless marriage ends, Janie runs away with Joe Starks. Joe is an ambitious young black man looking to create his own community on his own terms. The newly married couple arrive in the real-life town of Eatonville, Florida. Eatonville is a very special place to Joe because it was chartered by black people. Joe wants to see the town flourish as a place for prosperous black people to work and live. He installs a street light. He builds a general store with goods and services for the people of Eatonville. As Joe continues to build up the community, the residents decide that they want Joe to be a leader and to be a person who makes decisions on behalf of them for the community's good. They elect Joe to be their first ever mayor of the town. Joe is thrilled, and he's thrilled to take on the role, and he wants Janie to be the kind of wife that people in the community can look up to. He sees Janie as part of a higher class of black women that should not mingle with common people in the town. As a result, Joe forces Janie to work in the general store. He keeps her away from events in the town, and most importantly, he keeps her away from the general store porch. The porch in the story is where much of the activity in the town happens. It's the place where Eatonville residents get their information, sharing a good laugh about the goings-ons in the community, tell stories, gamble, play games like checkers and such. Because Janie's husband will not allow her to participate in the community gatherings on the porch, or as Hurston likes to call it, porch talk, she feels lonely and isolated from the community. The community also responds to Janie's absence. They often do not speak to her in the ways that they speak to each other. They assume that Janie is too good to hang out with them. They see this as Janie's fault and not the fault of her husband, because in their eyes, Janie is an outcast. It's no wonder why Janie feels lonely and removed from the community. The porch may seem like an ordinary place to gather, but it actually serves a very important function in this community. The porch, and subsequently porch talk, is a social space where the folk of the community reinforce their identities by distinguishing who they are as part of this greater whole. Through the process of socialization, the people of Eatonville know who they are by uncovering who they are not. As I stated earlier, difference points to how the community attempts to reinforce what the community sees as a set of normal ways that people in a community perform their roles. When the folk in the community do not perform the roles to their expectations, there can be trouble. And in the case of Janie, it feels like being exiled from one's community. The story of Matt Bonner and his yellow mule is a good example of how identity is reinforced through actions that begin on the porch. In the book, Matt Bonner has a yellow mule who is very stubborn. No surprise there. He's a mule. Yet the mule talkers on the porch love to indulge and make up stories about Matt and his mule. The stories are so fanciful that often these mule stories take on a life of their own. One day, Sam Watson, League Moss, and their friend Walter see Matt coming towards the porch. They decide to have a little fun with him. They tease him endlessly about his mule. One mule talker says, "The women folks got your mule. When I come around the lake about noontime, my wife said some of the others had the mule flat down on the ground using his sides for a washboard." The men laugh and Matt gets very angry. When the mule talker sees that Matt is affected, they keep teasing him. Another mule talker says, "Oh man, take no use of you getting mad. You know you don't feed the mule." Matt pushes back. He says he doesn't feed the mule because the mule is too mean to eat. The mule talkers agree that the mule is mean because Matt is too poor to take care of him. League says, "I knows he's mean. I seen him when he took after one of them Roberts chillins up the street. I would have caught him, and maybe would have trampled him to death if the wind hadn't changed all of a sudden and blowed the mule way off his course, him being so poor and everything." The mule talkers laugh, and Matt stomps away from the porch toward home. After that moment, Matt Bonner's yellow mule becomes somewhat of a celebrity in the town. The porch talkers continue to tell tall tales about the mule until everyone in the town sees the mule as more than an animal, but a member of the community. So much so that when the yellow mule dies, the community has a funeral for their dearly departed loved one. The moment is full of fun and good playful teasing. It's also an important moment that helps define who the yellow mule is and who Matt Bonner is. What role do they serve in the community? For the yellow mule, his role is the victim and the victor. The community must lift him up because his owner is just incapable. It is only through support of the community that the yellow mule becomes the victor in the story. Although the teasing is good fun, Matt Bonner is the neglectful owner and the villain in the story. It is because of Matt that the community must support the yellow mule when they see that the owner is incapable. Another moment where the porch becomes a site for how identity is reinforced through actions is a turning point of conflict between Janie and her husband, Joe Starks. In the moment, Joe berates Janie because she has made a mistake cutting tobacco for a customer in the general store. In front of the porch talkers, Joe points to parts of Janie's womanhood as the reason why she made the mistake. Janie is very hurt in this moment. She feels naked in front of the men. Janie fires back at Joe and attacks his masculinity in the same way that Joe attacked her womanhood. The porch talkers are stunned. They see Janie and Joe with new eyes. They have always seen Joe as a big man around town. They are astonished and disappointed to find out that Joe is, well, seemingly an average man. And from the way his wife describes it to them, he isn't a man at all. This changes the way they see Joe. Sam Watson says, "Great God, oh Zion, y'all really playing the dozens tonight." Playing the dozens is a competitive insult game typically played by men. Each person insults the other until the community decides a winner. The game is typically played by men, so the fact that Janie is participating is a big deal to the porch talkers and Joe. This moment also changes the way the porch talkers see Janie. That a wife would say such a thing to her husband in public is outrageous and disrespectful. It further isolates Janie from the community of porch talkers, a community that she desperately wants to be a member of. One porch talker says, "I'd rather be shot with tacks than to hear that about myself," says League Moss. Joe is embarrassed. From that day forward, he will be treated as lower by the porch talkers when he had always been in charge and had some measure of control over his identity. Like Janie, he feels completely naked in front of the men. He feels common in the court of higher opinion. He beats Janie in front of the men until she runs from the store. In this moment, Janie and Joe challenge each other in front of the porch talkers. Aspects of their marriage that had never been revealed in such a public way. Their identity as a married couple has shifted for a new identity to emerge that forever changes the relationship between the couple and the community. Gender identity also plays a huge role in this moment. Janie is expected by the community to be a good wife, which means that she is obedient to her husband. She has always played that role well up until now. When she breaks that role by insulting Joe in public, it changes the way the community expects women like Janie to perform their sex, which further isolates Janie from the female community as well. In the story, after Janie bruises Joe's ego, she becomes a pariah among the men and the women in the town. She is someone who doesn't respect her husband, so why should others respect her? So, while the porch may seem like a rather ordinary place, in their eyes we're watching God, it is a strong social space for reinforcing identity and difference. Next, we'll talk about how Hurston uses the porch to memorialize Southern Black folk subcultures. Where does the porch also appear in her collection of ethnographic folk stories like Mules and Men? In Their Eyes Were Watching God, Zora Neale Hurston's most iconic and memorable work of fiction, she memorializes the folk by including the real-life town of Eatonville, Florida, as the main location for the action in the novel. In Hurston's 1942 memoir, Dust Tracks on a Road, she notes that the township of Eatonville was established in 1886 by white abolitionists and chartered and built by Black people. This is a huge deal for a time period when Black people were treated horribly because of the color of our skin. But to have a town that was built by Black people for Black people was unheard of at the time. That town still stands today. This is very important and is a good reason why Hurston continued to memorialize the town in her creative writings. In real life, the town's first mayor was a man named Joe Clark from Georgia. Sound familiar? You bet. Janie's husband, Mayor Joe Clark, in the novel was based on the actual mayor of Eatonville, Mayor Joe Clark. There are also parts of Hurston's mother's relationship with her father that also appear in Their Eyes Were Watching God. For example, Janie and Joe have a very gendered relationship in that there are some things that men can do that women should not do. In the novel, Joe Clark is the mayor and owner of the general store. Janie is allowed to work in the general store but is discouraged from participating in community activities like porch talk. In real life, John Hurston, Zora's father, would not allow his wife Lucy, Zora's mother, to work at all, but did encourage her to socialize, supervised, of course. This put a lot of strain on Zora's parents that she then adds to the Joe and Janie fictional relationship in the novel. For Hurston, her creative work inspired her real-life experiences, and her real life inspired her creative work. She notes in her ethnography, Mules and Men, that she chose to collect stories in Eatonville because, quote, I knew the town was full of material. She goes on to say, quote, as early as I could remember, it was the habit of the men folks particularly to gather on the store porch of evenings to swap stories. Even the women folks would stop by and take a breath with them at times. As a child, when I was sent down to Joe Clark's store, I'd drag out my leaving as long as possible in order to hear more. For Hurston, the porch is an important site for community gathering and an active site for conflict that she writes about in the novel. In another example, in Their Eyes Were Watching God, Sam Watson and League Moss are the best of friends that enjoy playing the dozens, which I explained before was an active back and forth insult game. And they also play a game called Wolfing, which is a lying and tall tale game where each person exaggerates until one person gives up. Sam and League are enjoying playing a game of hyperbolic wits. In hyperbolic wits, Sam begins with a problem that he has been trying to untangle. He asks advice from his friend League. League spends about 5 minutes trying to decipher the premise of the argument. Why is this problem important? Sam follows up with, it's important because it's a problem. After another 5 minutes of back and forth, League forgets what Sam's initial problem was about at all. Sam settles it, that the problem is beyond League's scope, and heck, he's too smart, and League is too dumb. The porch talkers gathered scream and hoot with laughter. Again, this moment is like the one in The Yellow Mule that's full of playful banter. They are also energetic and compelling moments of dramatic tension in the story. Everyone on the porch and in the vicinity wants to know that who will win this test of wits. This is also an important moment where the engagement of the oral tradition reveals new information about the community. These are community members who continuously learn something new about the other through the process of engagement. And as readers, we come to know more about them through Hurston's eyes. In real life, you can imagine Zora Neale Hurston's delight when she would watch Who Won the Contest of Wits. Moments like this appear again and again in her collection of folklore, novels, plays, and in her self-penned autobiography, Dust Tracks on the Road. Finally, why does the porch and the experiences that are shared there matter? Why does memorializing the folk provide a positive legacy for Black folks today? In Their Eyes Were Watching God, Janie has been an outcast in her Eatonville community. When her husband, Mayor Joe Clark, dies, she meets a younger man, Tea Cake Woods, and decides to take a chance on love again. Tea Cake is everything that Joe Clark was not. He supports Janie in ways that help her come out of her shell. He renews her confidence. During their time in Eatonville, she becomes a fixture in the community, much to the surprise and for some the dismay to the community. After 8 months, Janie sheds her mourning clothes and starts wearing bright colors. Tea Cake's favorite color for her to wear is blue. She attends the community picnic in a blue dress. The town thinks that Tea Cake is only after Janie's money. Janie tells her best friend Phoebe that she doesn't care if Tea Cake is only interested in her money. He treats her as an equal in the relationship, and that is more than she can say about the other men who are trying to court her, or, in other words, the men that are trying to date her, and the surrounding community. The best part of Tea Cake and Janie's relationship is that they spend much of their time together on the porch. Tea Cake teaches Janie how to play checkers and how to play other games. He plays music on the porch, and the community members come by and come around to listen and listen. Janie shares the spotlight with Tea Cake. It is a joyous moment for Janie when she can be in community with the porch talkers. She even finds that she participates in the porch talk unlike the restrictions that Joe Clark put on her voice, and the ability to engage with the community is strong. After a while, the couple decide to move to the Florida Everglades. They have a very happy life creating the porch talk culture in their new community. With her love for Tea Cake, Janie learns a lot about herself along the journey. Tragedy strikes and Janie returns home to Eatonville. Their Eyes Were Watching God begins at the end of Janie's story. Janie reflects and decides to tell her story, the story of her life, to her best friend Phoebe. She must tell it so that Phoebe has some context for what's happened to her. In this moment, and through the process of telling the story, Janie is participating in the oral tradition of storytelling. From the perspective of the reader, we can see that during the telling, that Janie has learned how to embrace this vulnerable part of herself. As we looked at earlier, an oral tradition is a form of communication where cultural knowledge and information that are shared from person to person in an effort to keep community traditions and practices present and part of everyone's everyday lived experience. The stories and traditions that we share can be more profound than just hearing a good story or sharing a life lesson. These are part of the oral tradition, and we can can help shape the people we are, the people we become, and the people that folks expect us to be. For Janie, telling her story is certainly compelling and entertaining in parts, but it's also part of the oral tradition from one Black woman to the next. Janie's story helps shape the teller and the told in ways that communicate the importance of finding a Black woman's voice in a world that attempts to shut it down. It is also an important oral tradition for the reader and all audiences as well. We get to take a peek at what it meant to be a Black woman during the early 20th century and the trials and tribulations of one Black woman's pursuit to be heard and respected. Their Eyes Were Watching God is a compelling story of a Black woman truth teller and how she found her voice as a porch talker in her own way. So why does memorializing the folk provide a positive legacy for Black folks today? Zora Neale Hurston and Their Eyes Were Watching God, as well as her other writings and creative works, centers the Black experience around humanizing Black people. Her documentation of the oral tradition of storytelling contributes greatly to that cause. Black people are seen in her works as everyday humans. For good and for worse, she didn't create saints and demons. She depicted real complex people as individuals and within a community, and their stories reflect that. Particularly, her depictions of Black womanhood, like Janie and the other women that appear in the story, are rich with personality. As Janie tells her own story in Their Eyes Were Watching God, she finds her voice as a porch talker. Her voice is compelling and authentic to the experiences of Black women that Hurston deeply wants to be genuine and a personal experience. As we covered earlier, during the time period, Black people were being portrayed in the media as racist caricatures through white patriarchal imaginations and blackface minstrelsy. Black women were featured as mammies, hypersexualized women, and cartoonish and buffoonish caricatures. In fact, many Black women writers like Angelina Webb Grimke, Mary P. Perel, and Alice Dunbar Nelson focused on creating Black women characters who could counter these narratives and present real Black women who were proud, strong, resilient, and could promote propagandist ideologies for racial uplift. But few of Hurston's contemporaries used their female characters beyond their ability to promote important social causes, such as anti-lynching laws. While many people should and must turn to Grimke, Burrell, and Dunbar Nelson's works for insights into pressing political issues of the early 20th century, Zora Neale Hurston's position as an anthropologist and ethnographer offers glimpses into Black women's social networks and daily negotiations of racism and sexism that might otherwise go unnoticed. This was especially important to Hurston. She focused on retelling stories and histories about real Black women negotiating everyday situations. Her hope was that audiences would see the humanity and fullness of Black life through our own eyes. By including the stories of the folk, Zora Neale Hurston was creating an archive of real Black women and real Black people who lived beloved, vibrant, and meaningful lives in the early 20th century that we still remember today. Hurston's creative works demonstrate how keeping the oral traditions do play an important role in preserving Southern Black folk subculture for us and all of us today. Hurston's creative works also demonstrate that by maintaining an archive of these practices, it is an act of necessity to combat racist caricatures of Blackness even today. Memorializing the folk through the oral tradition marks an important place in understanding the totality of the Black experience. Today and always, we have lived genuine, authentic, and personal lives in the world that often seeks to limit the expectations and contributions of Black people, most notably Black women. As a follow-up to my lecture, I recommend the following readings. In The Power of the Porch, The Storyteller's Craft, and Zora Neale Hurston, Gloria Naylor, and Randall Keenan, Trudier Harris considers Zora Neale Hurston's special challenges as a Black woman writer in the 1930s, and how her various roles as an anthropologist, folklorist, and novelist intermingle in her work. The Porch becomes a site for Hurston to explore her identity as a Black woman and the various ways that she herself engages as a porch talker. And the reaffirmation of African American dignity through the oral tradition of Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, Anita M. Vickers takes a more structuralist approach to analyzing the oral tradition in the novel. She argues that Hurston uses oral traditions as a folkloric performance to present an image of Black women who embody dignity and respect. And finally, the Teachers Institute for Philadelphia, authored by Deborah Samuel, has a wonderful teaching unit that celebrates the oral tradition and Their Eyes Were Watching God. You can find this resource on their website at www.theteachersinstitute.org. I am Dr. Michelle Cohen-Gibbs, and I thank you so much for your time and attention and for holding so many ideas in your mind grapes. Blessings to you all, and be well.
Thanks to funding from National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities, Western States Arts Federation, Utah Division of Arts and Museums, Utah Legislature, Utah Humanities, Youth Educators Storytellers, yes, City of Murray, Zoo Arts and Parks, ZAP of Salt Lake County, Salt Lake City Arts Council, High Desert Brain Trust, Clever Octopus, the Ashton Family Foundation, and individuals like you. We appreciate the collaboration with the Salt Lake City Library System, Glendale Community Center, and neighboring schools, as well as the Summit Vista Senior Living. Special thanks to our American Sign Language interpreters, videographers, and volunteers. We celebrate the talents of our story artists, youth and adult tellers. Most of all, we appreciate you.